Alien student studied human pain tolerance and walked out in silence and terror. Part 1: The Invitation. The signal had come from a direction no human telescope had ever pointed. It arrived as a tight, clean burst of structured mathematics, prime numbers stacked in a sequence so deliberate that even the most skeptical scientists on Earth could not explain it away as background noise. That was 22 years ago. Now, two humans stood inside an alien space station orbiting a star that did not have a name in any human language, waiting for an elevator. Dr. Calvin Marsh was the taller of the two. He had wide shoulders, a thick neck, and hands that looked more suited to carrying heavy things than holding laboratory instruments. He was 43 years old, and he had spent the last 15 of those years studying how the human body responded to pain. Not in a cruel way. In a scientific way. He wanted to understand why some people could push through terrible things while others could not. His work had taken him to hospitals, to military research units, to remote field stations where injured people had done things that should not have been physically possible. He had filled 3 research journals with notes and still felt like he was only beginning to understand. Dr. Lena Ortega stood beside him. She was shorter, quieter, and had the kind of eyes that made people feel like she was solving a problem in her head even when she was just listening to you talk. She was 36 and specialized in comparing how different living things handled physical stress. She had studied insects, deep-sea creatures, large mammals, and a few organisms that did not fit neatly into any category. She had also, 7 years ago, fractured her wrist during a field survey in the Amazon and decided not to leave until the work was finished. The helicopter was 2 days away. She taped the wrist herself, took some painkillers, and kept writing in her notebook. Neither of them had expected to end up here. The Earth Scientific Council had received the formal invitation from the Velhari 6 months ago. The Velhari were the dominant academic species of the Galactic Cooperative, a civilization of cephalopod-descended beings who had been studying the universe for longer than humanity had been farming. Their invitation was polite, structured, and came with a long list of attached documents. Most of those documents were biological surveys of the human species, compiled from transmissions and broadcasts that had leaked into space over the last century. Radio signals. Television. Medical journals that had somehow been picked up and translated. The Velhari had questions. Specifically, they had one very large question that they had apparently been arguing about among themselves for some time. The question was about human pain tolerance. Their biological surveys showed numbers that did not make sense to them. Their models said those numbers were impossible. They wanted to understand how a species this fragile, no natural armor, no venom, no enhanced healing, could report experiencing what they reported experiencing and still function. Calvin had been recommended by 4 different research institutions. Lena had been recommended by 6. They had met for the first time 3 months before departure, in a conference room in Geneva, and had spent 2 hours talking before either of them realized they had not introduced themselves yet. The elevator arrived. It was large and smooth and had no visible buttons. A Velhari attendant guided them inside with a gesture from 2 of its 8 tentacle arms. The attendant was smaller than the researchers they had met at the docking port, and it moved with a kind of careful, precise grace, the way something moves when it has been trained to handle guests who are not entirely sure where they are. Calvin watched the walls of the elevator shift from a dark metallic gray to a soft pale blue as they descended. He did not know if the color was decorative or informational. He had learned quickly that with the Velhari, it was often both. Their assigned guide was waiting for them at the bottom. Its name, as best as the translation collar could render it, was Velcerathos. It was taller than the attendant, with longer arms and a broader spread of sensory clusters along the top of its head. It wore what appeared to be an academic sash across its upper body, a strip of woven material printed with symbols that, the translation system informed Calvin, indicated research rank and institutional affiliation. "The House of Knowing welcomes you," Velcerathos said. Its voice came out of the translation collar as something calm and slightly formal, like a university professor on the first day of term. "Your quarters have been prepared according to the atmospheric and gravitational specifications provided by Earth's Council. If they are not satisfactory, adjustments can be made." "They'll be fine," Lena said. "Thank you." Velcerathos inclined its head in what the translation matrix had already identified as a gesture of acknowledgement. Then it began to walk, and they followed. The corridors of the House of Knowing were wider than they looked in the briefing photographs. The ceilings were high, designed for species with different body shapes and sizes. Calvin passed a group of Dretheri researchers, thin, six-limbed beings with bioluminescent patches along their torsos, who slowed briefly and looked at the humans with open, unguarded curiosity before continuing on. He was getting used to being looked at. The curriculum begins in 3 days, Velcerathos said as they walked. The students have been briefed on the subject matter. There is considerable interest. How much do they already know about us? Calvin asked. They know what the cooperative's initial survey recorded. Your physical specifications. Your evolutionary history, as best we have reconstructed it. Your medical literature, which we have been translating for approximately 14 years, Velcerathos paused. It is the medical literature that generated the most discussion. What kind of discussion? Lena asked. Velcerathos moved 2 of its arms in a gesture that the translation matrix flagged as meaning something like careful consideration. There was a debate, it said, about whether the figures were accurate. Several of our physiologists concluded they must be the result of translation error. The values your species reports for sustained pain function are outside the range our models recognize as biologically compatible with continued cognitive operation. Calvin looked at Lena. Lena looked straight ahead. And what did the other physiologists conclude? She asked. That the translation was correct, Velcerathos said, and that we simply did not have a framework that could explain it. That, said Calvin, is why we are here. Velcerathos stopped outside a set of wide doors and turned to face them. Its sensory clusters were oriented directly toward the 2 humans in a way that felt, despite everything, oddly familiar, the way a person looks at something they have been thinking about for a very long time and are finally seeing in front of them. Yes, it said. That is exactly why you are here. The doors opened. Beyond them was a long corridor that smelled faintly of something Calvin could not name, clean and cool and just slightly sharp, like the air before a storm. He walked through. Lena walked through. The doors closed behind them without a sound. 3 days, Calvin thought. 3 days to figure out how to explain to 11 alien civilizations something that most humans had never needed to put into words, because for them it was simply the way things were. He had been trying to explain it to other humans his whole career. He figured alien scientists could not be that much harder. He was not entirely right about that. But he was not entirely wrong either. Alien students studied human pain tolerance and walked out in silence and terror. Part 2, the curriculum. The amphitheater was not what Calvin had expected. He had imagined something cold and clinical, rows of instruments, observation glass, the kind of sterile quiet that existed in high-level research facilities on Earth. What he found instead was something that felt almost like a theater. The room was round and open, with tiered observation levels rising in a wide circle around a central floor. The ceiling was high and curved, and it held a soft, even light that seemed to come from everywhere at once without any visible source. The alien students were already seated when Calvin and Lena were escorted in. There were roughly 60 of them, from 9 different species. Calvin had studied the briefing files on the flight over, so he recognized most of them. The Velhari occupied one section of the tiers, a group of about 20, their translation collars glowing faintly. The Dretheri sat in another cluster, their bioluminescent patches pulsing in slow, steady rhythms that Calvin now understood were something like neutral attention. 3 Kurath students sat in reinforced cradles near the lower tier, their dense bodies built for a world with twice Earth's gravity. Along the upper level, 4 sealed atmospheric chambers housed the Vorith, beings that existed as pressurized gas contained within flexible membranes, who communicated through controlled fluctuations in that pressure. They were all looking at the 2 humans who had just walked in. Calvin had presented research to audiences before. He had stood in front of rooms full of skeptical scientists and defended findings they did not want to believe. He was comfortable being looked at. But this was different in a way he was still figuring out how to categorize. These were not skeptical looks. They were careful looks. Curious looks. The kind of look a person gives something when they genuinely cannot predict what it is going to do next. Velcerathos introduced them with the formal precision typical of the House of Knowing. It recited their credentials, their research fields, their institutional affiliations, and then added, in a tone that was measured but carried a quiet weight, the human delegates have agreed to a voluntary demonstration curriculum. They will not only explain human pain response through lecture. They will also provide observed physiological data in real time. Any student who has an ethical concern about this methodology may file a formal objection. No objections were filed. The biometric monitoring suit Calvin wore was a collaborative design, built by Velhari engineers using specifications he and Lena had provided. It sat against his skin like a second layer, thin and light, covered in sensors that measured everything his body was doing. Heart rate, blood pressure, cortisol, endorphin release, nerve signal intensity at specific locations. Every number was broadcast in real time to screens on the observation tiers, translated into formats each species could read. He stood at the center of the amphitheater floor and let them look at the numbers for a moment. Baseline readings. A calm man in a calm room. What you are seeing now, he said, is a human body at rest. No stress. No pain. This is what normal looks like for me. He paused. I want you to watch what changes, and by how much, when I do this next thing. He reached into the container on the table beside him and took out a small capsule. He had prepared it himself, under observation from the Velhari medical team who had needed a great deal of reassurance that he was not going to cause himself lasting harm. The capsule contained a concentrated capsaicin extract, the compound that made chili peppers burn. The concentration was roughly 40 times what a person would encounter in a hot sauce. He had tested it before departure and knew exactly what it felt like. He swallowed it with a cup of water. The monitors changed immediately. The nerve signal readings jumped. Cortisol climbed. Endorphin levels began to rise in the slow, automated way they always did when Calvin's body detected something it did not like. Calvin set the cup down. His eyes watered slightly. He took one slow breath through his nose. That, he said to the room, his voice even, is approximately a 6. On a human scale of 1 to 10, where 10 is the worst pain I can imagine, that is a 6. My body is reading it as tissue damage even though no damage is occurring. The burn is real. The signals are real. He looked up at the observation tiers. I would describe the experience right now as uncomfortable. I would not describe it as an emergency. The Drethari students had gone very still. Their bioluminescent patches, which had been pulsing in slow rhythms, were now barely moving at all. The Velhari were still too, in their own way, a kind of total focused attention, like a room holding its breath. A query came through Velsarathos from one of the Velhari students. The human says 6. What is 10? Calvin considered this honestly. He had thought about how to answer this question before today. 10 is the point where it becomes very hard to think clearly. 10 is the kind of pain where the body starts overriding everything else and demanding your full attention. It is rare for a human to experience a true 10. Most of what we deal with in daily life, injuries, illness, physical labor, sits well below that. Velsarathos translated. Then another question arrived, this time from a Drethari student. The human's monitors show that the body is releasing chemicals to help cope with the pain. This happens automatically. Yes, Calvin said. My body does not ask me before it does that. It just starts. The moment it detects something wrong, it begins trying to help me manage it. And the human is also choosing, consciously, to remain calm. Yes. So there are two systems working at the same time. The body helping automatically. And the mind choosing. That is correct, Calvin said. The Drethari students' patches went through a slow, complicated color shift that the translation system did not render as words. Velsarathos later recorded it in its academic log as an expression of something for which Galactic Common did not have a precise term, the feeling of a framework beginning to bend under the weight of new information. Lena sat at the edge of the amphitheater and watched the alien students watch Calvin. She had done this kind of work long enough to know what it looked like when a room was genuinely surprised. Not politely surprised. Not academically surprised. Actually surprised, in the way that made people go quiet instead of loud. The room was very quiet. Calvin waited until the monitoring numbers had leveled out, his body settling into its coping rhythm, the initial spike fading as the automatic systems did their job, and then he looked up at the tiers again. I want to be clear about something, he said. I am not doing anything unusual right now. I am not performing. This is not a special skill that only I have. This is a standard human pain response. Most adult humans you could bring into this room would show you something similar. He paused. We grow up learning to do this. Some learn it earlier than others. Some get better at it over time. But the capacity is there in almost all of us. The Vorith chamber on the upper tier produced a slow pressure shift. The translation system rendered it as, "You said you learned to do this." Learning implies it was not always easy. Calvin nodded. No, it was not always easy. It still is not always easy. There are days when a 2 feels like a 7. The number is not the whole story. He thought for a moment. But we practice. And we remember that we have gotten through it before. And that helps. The amphitheater stayed quiet for a long time after that. Calvin picked up his cup of water and drank the rest of it slowly. The burn in his chest was fading now, as he had known it would. He felt the familiar dull warmth of the endorphin plateau settling in, that particular kind of tired but steady that came after something hard. 60 alien students watched his vital signs return toward baseline and said nothing at all. Alien students studied human pain tolerance and walked out in silence and terror. Part 3, Escalation. Lena took the second session alone. Calvin sat in the observation area, off to the side, while she stood at the center of the amphitheater in the biometric monitoring suit. The alien students had returned to their positions on the tiers. They were quieter at the start of this session than they had been at the start of the last one. Velserathos had noted in its academic log that 2 of the Drethari students had submitted additional reading requests after the first session. They had asked for more of humanities medical literature, specifically anything related to documented cases of continued function under physical stress. The Velhari Academic Library had 40 years of intercepted human transmissions to draw from. The reading list it generated was very long. Lena began without ceremony. Pain, she said to the room, is information. That is the most useful way I know to describe it. When something is wrong with your body, or when your body thinks something is wrong, it sends a signal. That signal is pain. The signal is saying, pay attention to this. Something may need to change. She moved to the calibrated compression device that had been set up on the table, a piece of equipment built by the Velhari medical team based on her specifications. It was a simple mechanism, a padded clamp that could apply precise, measurable pressure to a limb. She placed her left forearm inside it and secured it herself. The monitors broadcast her baseline vitals to the tiers. Everyone could see where she was starting from. I am going to increase the pressure slowly, she said. I want you to watch the monitoring numbers while I keep talking. I want you to see what a human body is doing when it is in pain and also choosing to stay calm at the same time. The compression began. She did not pause. The first thing the body does is notice. The nerve signals go up, you can see that already in the readouts. The brain receives the signal and begins to assess. How bad is this? Is this a real emergency? What do we know about what is causing it? The pressure continued to climb. Her voice did not change. In this case, my brain knows that I am in a controlled setting. I know what this device does. I know the Velhari medical team is monitoring me. So even as the pain signal rises, the emergency assessment comes back. This is not a crisis. A Kurath student submitted a question through its translation interface. You are choosing not to remove your arm. Yes, said Lena. Why? Because I want you to see what the numbers look like when a human is experiencing real pain and has decided not to react to it with panic. The decision is deliberate. I am not suppressing the pain. I am not pretending it is not there. She glanced up at the monitors. Look at the cortisol levels. Look at the endorphins. My body is responding completely normally. It is trying to help me cope. I am letting it do its job while I do mine. Its job, the Kurath student repeated, through the translation system. And your job is to keep talking. My job right now is to show you something, Lena said. So yes. Talking is part of that. The pressure increased another increment. The nerve signal readings on the monitors jumped clearly. The Drethari patches flickered in rapid, tight patterns. Calvin had learned to read these as something like agitation, or intense focus, or possibly both at once. Lena continued. There is something that happens in humans when we make a decision to go through pain rather than away from it. The brain starts treating the situation differently. Instead of the pain being the whole thing your mind is focused on, it becomes one part of a larger picture. The pain is still there, it is not disappearing, but your attention has somewhere else to be. Something else to hold on to. What are you holding on to right now? A Velhari student asked. Lena considered this honestly. This room, she said. And the fact that what I am doing right now might help you understand something important. That matters to me. It gives me something to point my attention toward. She let the compression sit at its current level for 30 more seconds, long enough for the monitoring numbers to stabilize at their new reading. Then she reached over with her right hand and released the clamp. She withdrew her arm slowly. There were visible pressure marks on her skin. She looked at them briefly, then looked up at the students. That was approximately a 5, she said. On the human scale. A real 5, not a polite one. The amphitheater was quiet in the particular way it had been quiet since the first session, not the quiet of boredom or confusion, but the quiet of people thinking very hard. Velcerathos moved from its position near the side wall to the center of the floor beside Lena. It looked at her arm, then at the monitors, then out at the students. Are there questions? It asked. Several came at once. Velcerathos selected them in order. The first was from Nithel, a Drethari student who had submitted the longest reading request after session 1. The human said there is a difference between tolerating pain and functioning through it. Can you say more about this? Lena nodded. Tolerating something means you are waiting for it to stop. You are enduring it, but you are not doing anything while it is happening. Functioning through it means the pain is present and you are still doing what needs to be done. You are not waiting. You are moving. And humans can do both. Yes. Which one we do depends on the situation. Sometimes waiting is the right answer. Sometimes it is not. The second question was from one of the Kurath students. Your historical records include many examples of humans who continued performing complex tasks while injured. Surgery. Construction. Combat. Were those humans functioning through pain or tolerating it? Functioning, Lena said without hesitation. In every case I can think of where a human pushed through something serious to complete a task, they were not waiting for it to end. They were moving through it because the task required it. The Kurath student was quiet for a long moment. Then, what makes a task require it? Lena thought about this carefully. It was a genuinely good question. Usually it is because someone else needs the task done. Or because the task will not wait. Or because leaving it unfinished means something important is lost. She paused. Humans are fairly good at deciding that something outside of themselves is more important than their own comfort at a given moment. The third session, 2 days later, was a lecture. Calvin stood at the center and presented the evolutionary history of human pain response, simple, plain, factual. He talked about the world humans had evolved in. The large predators. The harsh seasons. The injuries that came from farming and building and fighting and traveling long distances on foot. He talked about the simple, brutal logic of natural selection. The humans who kept moving when they were hurt were more likely to survive. The ones who survived passed the capacity down. We are not special, he said, at the end. We are not brave by nature. We did not choose to be this way. We are the result of a very long time on a very difficult planet. He looked out at the tears. Every person alive on Earth today is descended from someone who was hurt and got back up anyway. That is not a story we usually tell ourselves. But it is true. The room stayed quiet for a long time after he finished. Velcerathos recorded in its log that evening that 3 more students had submitted extended reading requests. It also noted, in a section of the log it had not originally planned to create, that it was beginning to feel something it could not fully name, a slow, growing sense that the cooperative's existing models were not going to survive contact with what these 2 humans were showing them. Alien student studied human pain tolerance, and walked out in silence and terror. Part 4, the question that changed everything. It was the 6th session, and Lena was not demonstrating anything. She stood at the center of the amphitheater with a data screen beside her, and she was simply showing the students' records. Historical records. Real cases from Earth's documented past. She had spent the previous 2 evenings selecting them carefully, not the most dramatic ones, not the ones that read like stories meant to impress, but the ones that were clean and factual and verifiable. She wanted the students to see the data, not a performance. The first set of records was from battlefield medicine. Soldiers who had treated other soldiers while wounded themselves. She did not editorialize. She read the documented injury levels, the documented actions taken, the documented outcomes. The monitors in the room were not connected to anyone's body today. There were no live readings to watch. Just numbers on a screen and Lena's voice describing what those numbers meant. The second set was from exploration history. People who had completed long journeys on foot or by sea after sustaining injuries that, by modern medical standards, should have required immediate rest and treatment. People who had kept navigating, kept making decisions, kept taking care of others, while dealing with fractures, infections, and blood loss. The third set was from medicine itself, documented cases of people who had insisted on finishing work before seeking treatment. Doctors who had continued performing procedures after cutting themselves. Researchers who had delayed leaving a field site. Ordinary people who had driven themselves to hospitals after incidents that should have left them unable to operate a vehicle. She was presenting all of this in a calm, measured way. She was not making it dramatic. Nithel, the Drethry student who had asked the most questions in every session so far, submitted a query part-way through. The translation system rendered it as, in these cases, the soldiers, the explorers, the researchers, they all had the choice to stop. In most cases, yes, Lena said. But they did not stop. No. And in each case, the reason they did not stop was because of someone else. Or something else. Not because of themselves. Lena paused. She looked at Nithel's section of the tier. In most cases, yes. That is correct. Nithel was quiet for a moment. Its bioluminescent patches cycled through a slow, uncertain pattern. Then it said something that Velsarathos translated carefully, because it was not a question. It was an observation the student was working out in real time, speaking it aloud as it formed. The pain tolerance is not only a physical thing. It is not only because the body was built to survive. It is because humans use the pain. They go through it towards something. The pain is not the destination. It is in the way of the destination. And humans walk through things that are in the way. The amphitheater went very still. Calvin, sitting at the edge of the room, felt something settle in his chest. He had been studying this for 15 years and he had never heard anyone put it that simply. He wrote it down in his notebook. He underlined it twice. Lena did not rush to respond. She let Nithel's words sit in the air for a moment. Then she said, quietly, yes. That is a very accurate description. Nithel's patches shifted again, slower this time, deeper in color. Then the numbers in your medical records, it said. They are not wrong. They are just describing something that requires a different kind of understanding. The numbers are real. But the explanation for why they are possible is not in the physiology alone. It is in what humans are trying to reach. Yes, Lena said again. Velsarathos had been standing near the wall, as it always did during sessions, observing and managing translation. Now it moved forward slightly. It asked a question that Calvin recognized, from the way Velsarathos paused before speaking, as something it had been holding for a long time. In your species history, Velsarathos said, are there examples of humans who endured great pain not to survive? Not to protect another person. Not to complete a task with a practical outcome. But because they believed that the pain itself was in service of something true. Something they felt they were meant to do. Lena set down her notes. She thought about how to answer this honestly. There were many examples. The difficulty was not finding them. The difficulty was knowing where to begin. Yes, she said. Many examples. And they chose this. They were not forced. They chose it. Velsarathos processed this. Several of the Velhari students near it were exchanging rapid, quiet signals in their native language, too fast for the translation system to catch all of it, but the tone was visible. Unsettled. Working hard. Velsarathos said, in the cooperative's biology, pain response is placed in the category of aversion and avoidance. Every species we have studied, including our own, treats pain as a signal to move away. To reduce. To prevent. Your species does this too, your medicine, your safety practices, your care for the injured. You clearly do not enjoy pain. No, Lena said. We do not. But you move toward it anyway, when something on the other side of it matters enough. Yes. We do not have a category for this, Velcerathos said. It was not said with distress. It was said with the careful, honest precision of a scientist acknowledging the edge of a map. In 4,000 years of cooperative biology, across 11 civilizations, we have not encountered this pattern. The concept of choosing pain as a path rather than treating it only as a wall. What do you call it? Nithel asked, directing the question at Lena. What is the word, in your language? Lena thought for a moment. There were many words. Courage. Sacrifice. Devotion. Endurance. Determination. None of them were quite complete on their own. All of them together came close. The simplest word, she said, is purpose. The room stayed quiet for a very long time after that. Calvin looked at the alien students on the tiers. He watched their various bodies, the Drethari patches barely moving, the Velhari completely still, the Kurath solid and unreadable in their cradles, the Vorith membranes holding steady. They were all sitting with something they had not expected to encounter when they signed up for this seminar. He could see it in the quality of their stillness. He had seen that kind of stillness before. In hospital rooms. In field research stations. In the faces of veterans he had interviewed who were explaining, for the first time, what had gotten them through something they could not explain any other way. It was the stillness of a person who has just understood something that changes the shape of everything around it. Velcerathos eventually asked if there were more questions. There were not. Not because the students had no questions, Calvin suspected they had many. But because some things need time to settle before they can be formed into words. The session ended. The students left slowly. No one spoke in the corridors outside, which Velcerathos later confirmed was unusual. In its experience, seminars at the House of Knowing ended with discussion, debate, the loud and lively exchange of ideas that academic gatherings were known for. This one ended in silence. A thinking silence. The kind that means something was understood, and the understanding is still finding its shape. Alien students studied human pain tolerance, and walked out in silence and terror. Part 5, What walked out of the amphitheater. The last session was not a demonstration and it was not a lecture. Calvin and Lena had talked about it the night before, sitting in the small common area of their quarters, drinking the closest thing the Velhari catering system had been able to produce to coffee. It was not very close. But it was warm and it was dark and it helped them think. They have seen the data, Calvin said. They have the numbers. They know the physiology. They know more than the physiology now, Lena said. Right. So the last session should not be us showing them more things. It should be them asking whatever they still need to ask. Lena turned her cup in her hands. They are going to ask things we are not sure how to answer. Probably, Calvin said. That is okay. We can say we are not sure. The session was announced to the students as an open conversation. No prepared demonstrations. No data screens. Just Calvin and Lena at the center of the amphitheater, and 60 alien students, and whatever needed to be said. It lasted nearly 7 hours. The Vorith students went first. They had been the quietest throughout the curriculum, their form of communication was more difficult to translate in real time, and they tended to observe more than they questioned. But they had been preparing. The question they submitted through their atmospheric interface was about childbirth. They had reviewed human medical records and found pain ratings they considered almost impossible to believe. They wanted Calvin and Lena to confirm whether those records were accurate. Calvin confirmed them. He walked through the physiology, the duration, the documented pain scales from clinical studies spanning many decades. He noted that for the vast majority of human history, this had happened without any medical intervention at all. Not because humans did not want relief, they did, they always did, but because the means did not exist yet, and life went on anyway. The Vorith membrane fluctuated in a long, slow pattern. The translation system rendered it as, and the humans who went through this, they were not exceptional people. They were ordinary people. Yes, said Lena. Completely ordinary. Billions of them, across all of recorded history. The membrane fluctuated again, differently. This time the translation system could not find a direct equivalent and offered an approximation, something between the concept of awe and the concept of being quietly undone by information you were not prepared for. The Kurath students asked about battlefield medicine next. Not the abstract version, they had specific cases they had pulled from the extended reading lists. They asked about particular documented incidents in which wounded humans had treated other wounded humans, or had organized evacuations, or had held positions that needed to be held. They asked Calvin to confirm details. He confirmed them, one by one, without embellishment. He did not need to embellish. The facts were already extraordinary. After the fifth confirmed case, one of the Kurath students asked, in your assessment, as a scientist who has studied this, is there a limit? Is there a point at which the human capacity you have been describing would fail? Calvin thought about this carefully before answering. Yes, he said. There is always a limit. Humans break. Humans give up. We are not invincible and we do not always succeed. He paused. But the limit is much further out than most people expect. Including most humans. We often surprise ourselves. Nithel asked about grief. It had been reading human psychological literature alongside the biological data, and it had noticed something that it could not resolve on its own. In human language, emotional pain and physical pain were described using the same words. The same frameworks. Loss felt like a wound. Heartbreak was named after a physical injury. Nithel wanted to know, was this metaphor, or was it something real? Lena answered this one. In human neurology, she said, emotional pain and physical pain activate overlapping regions of the brain. Social rejection, loss, grief, these create measurable responses in the nervous system that are genuinely similar to the responses created by physical injury. We believe the systems are connected. The pain of losing someone or something important is real pain. Not identical to physical pain, but not entirely separate from it either. Nithel's patches went very dim for a moment. Then, and humans endure this the same way. With the same purpose. They go through grief toward something. Sometimes, Lena said honestly. Not always. Sometimes it breaks people. But yes, many humans carry grief the way they carry a physical injury. They feel it, it costs them something every day, and they keep moving. They find a reason to keep moving. Nithel was quiet for a long time after that. Its patches stayed dim. Velsarathos asked the last question. It waited until most of the other students had finished, until the room had gone through several rounds of questions and answers and long silences in between. Then it stepped forward from its position near the wall and asked the question that Calvin had suspected it had been building since the first session. When you consider everything you have shown us here, Velsarathos said, do you believe that humans are aware of how unusual this is? Does your species understand what it is? Calvin leaned back in his chair and thought about this honestly. No, he said. Most of us do not think of it as unusual. Most of us think it is just what people do. You get hurt, you keep going. You lose something, you find a way through. You are afraid, you do the thing anyway. He looked at Velsarathos. It is so ordinary to us that we do not usually examine it. It is like asking a person if they are aware of how unusual it is that their heart beats. It just does. We do not think about it. Velsarathos was quiet for a moment. Then it said, it is not ordinary. I want you to understand that clearly, from the perspective of someone who has studied 11 other civilizations. What you have shown us this week is not ordinary. Among every species in the cooperative, pain avoidance is a foundational drive. It shapes how we build things, how we make decisions, how we structure our societies. We have spent 4,000 years creating systems designed to reduce pain as much as possible. That is what intelligence is used for, in our experience. You have done this too, your medicine, your safety systems. You clearly do not want pain. We do not, Calvin agreed. But you go through it, Velsarathos said. When something on the other side of it matters. You pay the cost and you walk through. It paused. We did not have a category for this. We still do not, fully. What you have shown us this week has no name in cooperative science. We are going to need to build one. Lena looked at the empty tiers, at the places where 60 alien students had sat in growing silence over 8 days. Did we frighten them? She asked. Velcerathos considered this for longer than she expected. Not in the way you might think, it said finally. They are not afraid of humans in the way one is afraid of a threat. They are afraid of what it means that beings like you exist. What it says about what you might attempt. What you might endure. What could not stop you, if you decided something mattered enough. Calvin picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. We are not trying to be frightening. We are just people. I know, said Velcerathos. That is the part that stayed with them most. It paused once more. Then, in the tone that Calvin had learned to recognize as the Velhari equivalent of the deepest kind of academic respect, we will be submitting a formal proposal to the Cooperative Council to establish a new research category. What you have shown us, pain chosen and survived in service of something beyond the self, endurance as a form of care, suffering as a path rather than only a wall, these things do not fit inside what we already know. We will need new language. New frameworks. It will take time. We have words for it, Lena said quietly. Several of them. It is going to take a while to explain them all. Velcerathos made the slow gesture that meant a sincere and considered agreement. Yes, it said. I expect it will. Calvin and Lena walked out of the House of Knowing together, down a long corridor that smelled faintly of that clean, cool, pre-storm air, and neither of them said anything for a while. There was nothing that needed saying. They had come here to explain something that most humans had never needed to put into words, because for humans it was simply the way things were. Behind them, in the amphitheater and in the research wings and in 11 different atmospheric habitats across the station, 60 alien scientists from 9 different civilizations sat quietly with what they had learned. Some things need a long time to settle. This was one of them.